Hello, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome back to the Zombie Train. This is episode number 258, and we are about 5 episodes away from a route review, which is coinciding nicely with what I talked about in the Terminus podcast, where so many people are getting into trains again and building routes. So, because I can't wait to review every single one of them, and they have, 5 weeks to make them good. So we'll see who of this run will get reviewed and how well they'll do. Anyways, so this footage is from Under Construction episode 43. We're playing with bridges and terrain and all sorts of fun junk like that. But today we're here to talk about stopped trains. Eastrail 11 asked me a question way back on episode 214. He asked, is there any chance that you possibly were on a one-track main line and another train was stopped in front of you? What would you do? Like any train or an intermodal? Well, I would like to mention first of all that if it's an intermodal, we would probably try and see what's in all the crates first, in all the containers, before doing anything with it. If it was a section of track that we were unfamiliar with, we would usually proceed at like restricted speed, something where at least we can stop if we see something ahead of us. And there were plenty of times where there were trains abandoned out there on the main line. But a lot of times you would see trains that were abandoned in yards on the main. So when we were approaching a yard, we were very, very careful to not just charge through. If we had somewhere to be, we would risk it occasionally, but more often than not, if we knew where we had to go, we'd probably covered those rails before. Because if you think about it, we were running through areas, in the example that we're running through an area where we had never been before, we would have to be cautious of switches that were lined against us, first of all, which those are less of a problem, but more importantly, switches that aren't going to take you in the direction that you want to go. And, maybe they run you to a dead-end track. Maybe, that could screw the train up because you would go off the end of the rail through the buffers. You don't want to do that. Maybe they run into a section of abandoned track that hasn't been maintained in many years before the war, and it just can't handle the weight of a Mikado. There were plenty of things we had to be concerned about when we were passing over a new track, and the possibility of a stopped train being in front of us was one of them. And it did happen from time to time. The things that were most unusual, though, unless it was a location that we knew there was car storage going on in, is when we would run into a train and it wouldn't have an engine on it. If there was car storage, then it wouldn't be much of an issue. You'd usually be left with a bunch of empty cars, and you'd be able to just, back up, drag them to a location where you could put them off to the side. As we went through areas, we tended to make our own maps as best we could. Other than that, we used maps that we gathered from yard offices and places like that, and whatever we could pull off the internet when we could get access to servers and things like that. But the fact of the matter is that occasionally we would come on a train that was just full, and with no engines on it, no way to get them, no way to get it to move on its own. Or occasionally with engines that were out of fuel, which that was a pain, but it was solvable if we managed to get our hands on some more diesel, which was sometimes a pain, but we could usually do it if we really, really needed to. If we couldn't drag it on our own. We would come across a train with no engines and a full load. There was a point in time where we came across a train which was that, and it was a coal train. And we came upon it from the non-Fred end, so we knew the engines must have come out towards us, but we didn't, notice passing any singular engines. It was not uncommon for people, especially people in the railroading business, to try and grab an engine as sort of an escape, or whatever, if they're trying to get back to their family during the Great Panic, or shortly thereafter if they're trying to get somewhere. People snagging engines, those that knew how to use them, was not uncommon at all. We would find engines just on their own. We found plenty of engines in ditches, and there were multiple occasions where people had driven locomotives through areas and crashed them and taken a not insignificant portion of the track right along with it. And we had to have all sorts of annoying, what's the word? All sorts of annoying stops and starts for little minor pieces of track that had been bent out of shape or that were out of gauge. If we even thought there was going to be track out of gauge, we would slow to a crawl, and we would look ahead, and we would periodically test, even if the track was that bad. We would test it to see if it was in gauge or not. 3254, to the credit of the locomotive, was pretty good at getting over some bad track. But there was a limit to everything, and more importantly, there were a couple of times where we ended up on the ground, and we had to get back off the ground using some re-railing frogs and just the locomotive. Wherever possible, we would actually try to bring the locomotive forward. We'd make sure the track in front of it was in gauge, and we would just try to run the locomotive forward onto a re-railing frog up onto the track where it belongs, instead of running backwards into the train. Because there were situations where we had a pretty heavy train that was tough to start, and if we came off the track, the lack of traction from being on the ground, combined with the fact that we had a heavy train, kind of meant that we really were going to have a bad time if we tried to back up immediately. So the solution was to try and pull the engine more forward. Sometimes that caused more problems, but more often than not, we were able to get the track right in front of the engine in good enough shape that we could bump up onto it. That was harder to do when it would be like the first set of drivers. If it was one of the last two sets or the trailing truck, then it was easier to take care of. Sometimes we'd run over some track and it would feel like it withstands it and then breaks. And then it would break when we were part of the way over it. And if we were being particularly cautious, which we would, then we would just lose the rear of the engine and maybe the tender. Although we did have a moment where we managed to derail the rear of the tender and the first coal car. We kind of dumped John out onto the ground. We pinned the wires underneath the car, and they started shorting out, and then we had a fire that erupted out of that electrical short, which underneath the hopper full of coal is a problem, but we managed to clear most of it away because we realized what was happening because the wires on both ends were heating up. We realized what was happening, and we were able to cut the power and then shovel enough coal out of the way to access what, sort of where the fire was beginning. It hadn't exactly engulfed much. It was just a hot spot in the side of the hopper. But anyways, we ran upon this coal drag, and it had no engines on it, and it was on a grade. It was a downgrade leading away from us, and we were kind of at the top of the hill. I can only assume that the engineer tried to get up the hill and, with this train, and then got stuck or gave up or decided he didn't need the train, stopped, uncoupled, or, maybe he just stopped there. That was another thing that popped into my head, was maybe he just stopped there, and then somebody got it later, realized they couldn't start the train on the hill, and, whatever. The train was compressed, actually. Somebody had tried to start the train. They'd applied the brakes, and then done their best to compress the train, which on a hill is not an easy task when you're the engine at the top of the hill. There may have been pushers at the rear end that were no longer there. That would explain why it was compressed. But nonetheless, it was a compressed train. Actually, that would explain... No. Did I say we ran into the fret end earlier? Because that would be wrong. That would be a different instance that I'm thinking of. Because we ran into a fret end and we assumed there was a locomotive on the other end. So we didn't try to move it. It was a very, very long, empty train. We didn't try to move it because we figured there were engines on the other end, so we sent people up to check. And this was somewhere in Appalachia. So we couldn't access the front of the train easily. We ended up having people sort of shimmying along on the side of the bridge, climbing through cars, and eventually they got to the front of the train and there was no engine. And we could have just moved it. We could have just, coupled into the air and had probably very little issues moving this massive empty train of hoppers. But yeah, there was, like I said, there was a bridge in the way. There was stuff. We couldn't just get in the Jeep and drive to the front of the train. And we couldn't really just walk to the front of the train either, because it was, there were some tight squeezes and, like I said, a bridge that you couldn't just climb down and climb back up. So, that being said, that was the empty train. This was the full train. The full train did not have a Fred, which, thinking back would lend credence to the idea that there were pushers on this train too. And that's why it was compressed, yada yada. Either way, we had a compressed train. We figured out there were no engines on it. So we decided to couple up to the train and try to air it up. We made a mistake. We didn't realize how the grade was. So what ended up happening was, I had the independent on for whatever reason. And that's error number 1 right there. I probably had the independent on because I slammed everything on because this train came out of nowhere. But that's speculating on my own past actions. I don't really remember. But I left the independent on. Throttle must have been at 0 in neutral. We were just trying to just air up the train. We were trying to see how long it would take to air up the train. And then we would start rolling and I would, apply the brakes again. Just so we could get a feel for it, so we could charge everything. And the train brake ended up in release. The independent brake was still on full. I guess that would be the emergency setting, although I don't really remember if the independent has a designated emergency setting. I don't think it does. And the rest of the train was weighing us down on the flat section of this hill, and maybe it was even a little downgrade towards the caboose. But the coal train in front of us was also on a downgrade, like away from the engine. And it took us way too late to realize that when we aired up the train, we didn't start moving because of the independent brake, but the end of the train started moving, and it pulled out the slack in those cars. Bum, 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 ba 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 bum. And when that pulled out and reached the engine, it ripped the coupler out of the front of the engine. It ripped it out of the pilot. And the string of cars took off down the hill. And their brakes automatically applied eventually, but did not, they already gained a lot of momentum. You had the rear car ran out of air first, and then the next, and then the next, and then the next. And, we found this train with, 24 of its cars crumpled in a pile in a ditch with coal everywhere, and the rest of the train just sort of sitting again, like it was taunting us. And I have no idea where the coupler went. I can only assume it went flying. But that was one of the biggest problems. That was one of the hallmark things. Of course, then we were crippled. Then we didn't have a front coupler. We pulled up to the train again, realized we couldn't do anything, and we had to pull a coupler off of one of the destroyed cars, fit it to 3254, which it didn't jive well. Paul had to cut some stuff off, and I think just, sort of make a makeshift bolt to hold it in, because some stuff inside had sheared. It was not a pretty sight, the pilot of that locomotive, after the coupler went flying. But yeah, that's the priority was, we would go slow, we would find a train, we would do our best to move it out of the way after we figured out what was in it. The coal drag situation was an extra pain in the butt, not only because it took our front coupler out, but because we could have used that coal, and 100 tons of hopper, 24 hoppers, that's 24,000 tons of coal. Or no, 24 hopper, 2,400 tons of coal. that was just dumped by accident, by stupidity, because I left an independent break on and because I don't know. That was, anyways. Hope you guys enjoyed this video. I'll see you next week. Trainman out.